Welcome to our deep dive on inflation.
Hmm.
We have some really interesting sources this time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Excerpts from what looks like an economics textbook.
Okay.
It's called Inflation FIN 311 1.pdf.
Mm-hmm.
And then also a bunch of photos
Mm-hmm.
of pages 85 through 104.
Wow. Lots of diagrams in those pages. Right.
Yeah, there are a lot of diagrams, so
This is going to be
it'll be fun.
a fun one. It's going to be a visual one for sure. But yeah, it's a really great mix of materials
Yeah,
to like get into the nitty-gritty of how inflation works,
totally.
what causes it, what it means for you.
Okay, so let's unpack this, right? I guess we should start with the basics.
Yeah, the basics.
What exactly is inflation?
Well, I mean, simply put, it's a continuous rise in prices over time.
Okay.
It's not just a one-time jump,
Yeah.
It's that steady climb
Yeah.
that makes it inflation.
Okay, so one of the sources that you sent puts it another way. It says, inflation happens when too much money is chasing after few goods. And I really like that. It's a good image.
It's visual.
Yeah.
Yeah, very visual. Imagine, everyone wants the same limited edition item.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's only so many, right?
Yeah.
That scarcity drives the price up.
Right. So is a little bit of inflation always a bad thing then?
Not necessarily. One of the sources points out
Okay.
that mild inflation can actually be a sign of a healthy, growing economy.
Interesting.
Yeah, it can even encourage investment,
Okay.
keep things moving.
So it's more about the pace of inflation.
Exactly. It's not just
Right.
that prices are rising.
Okay.
It's how fast they're going up. The source material actually talks about like different degrees of inflation, right? Like mild inflation, as we
Yeah.
just said. That might be manageable, maybe even beneficial.
Okay.
But then you have like galloping inflation, where prices rise really rapidly, and then, of course, hyperinflation.
Yeah, the textbook mentions Germany.
Oh, yes.
Classic
In
example.
the 1920s as an example of that.
It's like a loaf of bread
That's
costing
crazy.
millions of marks.
Right. Imagine trying to budget in that environment.
Yeah.
Hyperinflation can really destabilize an economy
Yeah.
and make money practically worthless.
Okay, so we've got like the spectrum, right?
Yeah, like a spectrum of inflation.
Of inflation from mild to wild.
Mild to wild,
I
exactly.
mean, what causes it?
Well, that's where the fun begins. This is where we get into the different schools of economic thought.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a bit like
Different.
teams, with competing theories.
Okay, so who are the main contenders here?
So one group, we can call them, the Keynesians, they often go by that.
Right.
They believe that inflation is driven by excessive demand, like too much money
Okay.
circulating in the economy.
Right, so like our limited edition item.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
And you actually have an illustration of this
Yeah.
in the source material, figure 5.2 on page 99.
Okay.
It's labeled demand pull inflation. And it shows how increased demand can lead to both higher prices, increased output.
So in this case, businesses would be producing more, but they're also charging more.
Precisely. But then, we have another group, often called monetarists,
Okay.
and they argue that inflation is caused by, rising production costs.
So it's not just about consumers wanting too much.
Right. It's not just about demand. It's about the actual cost of making things going up.
Interesting.
Wages, raw materials, energy. If those costs increase, it can push prices upward even if demand stays pretty much the same.
Got it.
And guess what?
What?
You have a diagram for this one, too.
Oh, of course they do.
Figure 5.3, page 100,
Okay.
shows cost push inflation.
Okay.
We see a decrease in supply because of those rising production costs,
Right.
leading to higher prices, but that doesn't necessarily impact output.
Oh, interesting. So in that case, businesses might be producing the same amount,
Yeah.
but they have to charge more just to,
To cover their expenses.
Yeah.
Exactly. And what I find really fascinating is that your source material actually gives some real-world examples from Nigeria.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I love those real world
It
examples.
shows how these types of inflation
Yeah.
can play out in a real economy.
Yeah. So tell me about those Nigerian examples.
Okay, so one example is the period of excessive money supply in Nigeria
Okay.
during the 1970s and 1980s, which was driven by government policies.
Okay.
This is like a textbook case of what can lead to demand pull inflation.
Right. Too much money circulating. Everyone's chasing the same goods. Prices go up. Got it.
Exactly. But then the sources also highlight a decline in agricultural production in Nigeria,
Right.
which led to shortages of food and other essential goods, and obviously prices went up.
So that's an example of cost push?
Yeah, cost push inflation. The cost of producing food went up, so the price of food went up.
Right.
Exactly. And then there are a couple of other interesting factors the sources mentioned.
Yeah.
Like, for example, increased rural-urban migration, which put more pressure on demand in urban areas.
Right.
And then there was the whole issue of middlemen and monopolies,
Yeah.
which could cause artificial price hikes.
It sounds like a pretty complicated web.
It is complicated, yeah.
But it's interesting how it all connects back to those two core ideas.
Yeah, it really does, yeah.
Demand pull and cost push.
Exactly. These theories aren't just abstract. They're playing out in
Mhm.
economies all the time. And this kind of brings us to the question
Okay.
that's probably on everyone's mind.
Yeah. What does it mean for me?
Exactly. How does inflation actually affect me personally?
Right. We've been talking about these big theories
Yeah.
and things, but
Right, but what about, everyday people?
yeah.
Right. Well, it's important to understand that the impact of inflation is not
Okay.
uniform. It affects different parts of society in different ways.
Right. The textbook mentioned pensioners specifically.
Yeah, good example. People on fixed incomes, like pensioners, are often hit the hardest by
Mhm.
inflation because their income stays the same,
Right.
but everything's getting more expensive.
yeah.
It's like their money's losing value
Yeah.
over time. But on the other hand,
What?
the sources also suggest that businesses and shareholders
Yeah.
might actually benefit from inflation,
Oh, interesting.
at least in the short term.
How does that work?
Well, if businesses can raise prices faster than their costs are increasing,
Yeah.
they can see their profits go up,
Okay.
and those profits can be passed on to shareholders.
Right. Right. Okay. But the sources also said that sustained high inflation is bad for everyone in the long run,
Yeah, it's not sustainable.
even if some people benefit in the short term.
Exactly, yeah.
So why is that?
High inflation creates a lot of uncertainty and instability. Businesses can't really plan for the future.
Right.
Consumers have trouble making informed decisions.
Right.
The whole economy becomes less predictable and more volatile.
Okay. So if inflation can be have such serious consequences, what can be done to control it?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. Well, the sources outline a few key approaches.
Okay.
One of the main tools is something called monetary policy, which is mainly controlled by central banks.
And what kind of things can central banks do?
So they have a couple of powerful levers, so to speak. One is adjusting interest rates.
Okay.
Raising interest rates can make it more expensive to borrow money, which can slow down spending and cool down an overheated economy.
Oh, okay.
And they can also control the money supply,
Okay.
which directly influences how much money's circulating.
Got it. And then there's fiscal policy, right, which is like the government's realm.
Right, exactly. Fiscal policy involves government spending and taxation.
Mm-hmm.
By increasing or decreasing spending or adjusting tax rates, they can try to influence the overall level of economic activity
Okay.
and, in turn, inflation.
So the sources also mention some more direct, I guess, physical measures.
Yeah, things like price controls and wage freezes.
Okay.
A little more controversial. They're often seen as less effective in the long run
Oh,
and sometimes can have, negative unintended consequences.
Right.
It's like putting a bandage on a much deeper problem.
Yeah. So it sounds like controlling inflation is kind of like a balancing act.
It is. It
You
is.
need to use different policy tools and address the underlying causes.
Exactly. You don't want to just treat the symptoms.
Right.
Absolutely. It's complex, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
This has been a fantastic overview.
Yeah, it's been great.
We've covered so much ground,
We have, yeah.
like from defining it, exploring its causes, and even looking at the tools
Tools
that policymakers
policymakers use
to try to manage it.
Right. And we've only just scratched the surface.
I know, right?
There's so much more we can explore, especially
No.
the social and political dimensions of inflation, and maybe even some emerging factors that would reshape how we think about how it works.
I'm eager to dive into that.
Yep.
But for now, I think it's time for us to
Take a breather.
take a little breather. We'll be right back to continue our deep dive into this fascinating world of inflation.
It is fascinating.
Yeah.
It really is. It's fascinating how those different schools of economic thought we were talking about,
Yeah.
the Keynesians and the monetarists,
Right.
they actually influence how policymakers approach controlling inflation.
Oh, that's a good point. So how do those theoretical differences actually play out
Yeah.
in the real world?
Well, if policymakers think that excessive demand is the main driver.
Okay.
They're more likely to use monetary policies, like restricting the money supply
yeah.
or raising interest rates.
Okay.
It's like tapping the brakes
Right.
on a speeding car.
Okay. Slowing things down to keep those prices from rising too quickly.
Exactly.
Okay, so what if they think it's more cost push,
Yeah.
where rising production costs are to blame?
Right. In that case, they might focus more on fiscal policies
Okay.
aimed at addressing those underlying cost pressures.
Okay.
So, for example, investing in infrastructure to reduce transportation costs, or offering subsidies to businesses to cope with higher energy prices.
So it's not about picking a side, like demand or supply.
Right.
It's about like understanding the...
It's understanding
Get
the
up, Rob.
specific drivers, yeah.
Okay.
Context is everything.
Right. You need the right tool for the job.
Exactly. And speaking of context,
Yeah.
your source material brings up another really interesting factor.
Okay.
Inflation expectations.
Inflation expectations.
Yeah. So basically, it means that if people expect prices to go up,
Okay.
that can actually contribute to prices going up.
Really? So just thinking prices are going to go up.
It's like a
They go up.
self-fulfilling prophecy.
Wow. How does that work?
Well, if businesses expect inflation,
Okay.
they'll start raising their prices in anticipation. And if workers expect inflation, they'll demand higher wages.
Right.
All of this creates a spiral.
Wow. So psychology plays a role in economics, too.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like if enough people believe prices will rise,
Yeah,
it can become reality.
exactly. It's
Yeah.
powerful. That's why central banks spend so much time
Oh, good.
trying to manage expectations. They try to maintain credibility and convince people that they're serious about keeping inflation under control.
So it's not just about the policies they're enacting.
Right.
It's about communication.
It's about managing the narrative.
Yeah.
As well as the economic levers. And this brings us to something that's often overlooked
Okay.
in those traditional discussions of inflation,
Yeah.
the social and political dimension.
Oh, okay. Now we're getting to the good stuff.
Yeah, right.
I'm really interested in how this, plays out in the real world.
Absolutely. And it's crucial for understanding inflation. So, for example, the sources point out that inflation can actually worsen existing social inequalities.
Right? Like those pensioners.
Exactly. Those pensioners struggling to keep up with the rising cost of living.
Yeah.
But it's even broader than that. Lower income households.
Right.
They're often hit the hardest by inflation
Right.
because they spend a larger proportion of their income on essentials,
Okay.
like food and energy, which tend to be the most affected
Right.
by those price increases.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even if wages are going up,
Yeah.
they might not be keeping pace.
So you can have a situation where someone's technically making more money,
Yeah,
but they're actually worse off.
exactly. They can't buy as much.
Right.
And this kind of economic strain
Yeah.
can lead to social unrest and political instability.
Interesting.
The source material even mentions how inflation has been a factor
Wow.
in political upheavals throughout history.
So it's not just an economic problem.
It's not just an economic problem.
It's a social and political problem, too.
Absolutely. And that's why it's crucial to have policies
Yeah.
that promote both stable prices
Okay.
and sustainable and inclusive growth, thinking about those long-term consequences.
Right. Not just the short term.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. It really shows how complicated it is
It's complex.
to manage an economy.
Yeah,
There are so many things to consider.
absolutely. And this leads us to a really important point.
Okay.
The sources we've been talking about,
Yeah.
they focus on those traditional economic theories, right?
Yeah. Demand pull, cost push, all that.
Exactly. But in today's world,
Yeah.
those models might not be telling the whole story.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, we live in a globalized world.
Well,
Economies are interconnected
Yeah.
in ways they've never been before.
So does that mean that, like, inflation in one country can affect another?
Exactly. Even if they have good domestic policies.
Wow. So you could be doing everything right
Yeah.
and still be affected by what's happening somewhere else.
That's the challenge, right? Yeah, of a globalized economy. And then there's technology,
Right.
which can lead to both deflationary and inflationary pressures.
Wait, so technology can cause inflation and deflation?
Sometimes, yeah, at the same time.
Okay, that seems counterintuitive.
Right, but think about it.
Yeah.
Technology can make production more efficient, leading to lower costs
Okay.
and lower prices. That's deflationary. But it can also create whole new products and services
Right.
that people want. which drives up demand and potentially leads to inflation.
So it's kind of like a two-sided coin.
Exactly. It can push prices in either direction.
And then, of course, there's climate change.
Oh, of course. The big one.
Yeah.
It's already disrupting those supply chains
Right.
and increasing the cost of resources,
Yeah.
especially in agriculture and energy.
So we could see more cost-push inflation
Yeah,
because of climate change.
very real possibility.
Wow.
And it highlights the need for a more holistic approach, one that takes into account those broader global challenges. It's
Yeah.
like we need a new playbook
Yeah.
for the 21st century.
Exactly. One that recognizes how interconnected everything is.
It really is.
We need to move beyond those simple models and embrace the complexity. Inflation isn't just about numbers on a chart. It's a reflection of our interconnectedness, our technology, and our relationship with the planet.
Wow, that's a really powerful way to think about it.
It really is.
It's making me rethink my understanding of inflation completely.
It should, because understanding inflation is ultimately about understanding how our world works, how different systems interact, and how our choices, both individually and collectively, contribute to that bigger picture.
Wow. It's like we went from Economics 101
Yeah.
to like a full-blown analysis of like
Right.
how the world is connected.
And we only just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
But that's what's so interesting about inflation. It's not just an economic phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's woven into politics, social dynamics, technology, even the environment.
Yeah, it really is. It's like this lens.
Right, like a lens through which we can see how all these systems
Right.
interact.
And influence each other. Yeah. It really highlights the need for policymakers to think systematically,
Yeah.
to understand that actions taken in one area
Right.
can have unintended consequences
Absolutely.
across the whole system.
It makes me think about those physical measures
Yeah.
we were talking about earlier, like price controls and wage freezes.
Right, right.
Like, they sound tempting, right?
Yeah.
As a quick fix,
Yeah.
but maybe they're too simplistic. Like maybe they ignore those larger
You're right.
systemic forces you're talking about.
You're absolutely right. Trying to control prices or wages directly can often backfire.
Yeah.
It distorts markets, can lead to shortages, even fuel black markets.
Okay.
It's like squeezing a balloon.
Right.
You might suppress the pressure in one spot,
Yeah.
but it'll just pop up somewhere else.
So it all comes back to unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences, exactly. And it really just emphasizes the need to address those root causes of inflation.
Right. Not just like putting a Band-Aid on it.
Exactly. You got to understand the whole picture to find those lasting solutions.
This has been such a good deep dive.
It's been fun.
We've covered so much.
We have.
You know, from the basic definitions to the complex causes,
Right.
the different ways to manage it. I feel like I've learned so much.
It's been great.
And we even talked about those broader challenges, right? Globalization, technology, climate change. It's really reshaping how we think about inflation.
It really is.
So what does all this mean for our listener? What should they take away
Yeah.
from all of this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that inflation is more than just a number,
Right.
on a chart.
Right.
It's a force that shapes our life. It influences our choices,
Yeah.
and it impacts the future of our societies. It's something we need to understand and engage with.
It really is. So staying informed, staying engaged
Yep.
is really key here. We need to understand the forces at play
Absolutely.
and hold our policymakers accountable for, making sound economic policies.
Right. And maybe most importantly, we need to be aware of our own role in the system.
Right.
Our expectations, our consumption habits, our political choices, all these things contribute to the complex dynamics of inflation.
That's a great point. So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
here's a question for you to ponder.
Okay.
The source material focused mainly on, the government responses to inflation. But what about individual actions? How can we, as individuals,
Yeah.
navigate inflation, protect our own financial well-being, and even make choices that contribute to a more stable and equitable economy? It's something to think about. We hope this deep dive has given you the tools and knowledge
Yeah, absolutely.
to start exploring those questions.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.